It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, and the park was alive with its usual sounds and sights. The soft chatter of families enjoying picnics, the rhythmic thud of joggers' shoes hitting the gravel paths, and the cheerful giggles of children playing on the swings filled the air. Dogs of all shapes and sizes darted about, chasing sticks, barking happily, or tugging on their owners' leashes. The crisp scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of blooming flowers, creating an atmosphere of peace and liveliness. Walking calmly along one of the winding trails was Sarah Coleman. Sarah was a young woman in her late 20s with dark hair tied back neatly and a serene smile on her face. She held a harness in her hand, her fingers lightly gripping the handle as she moved steadily forward. At the other end of the harness was Max, her golden retriever. His golden fur gleamed in the afternoon sun, and his ears perked up as he navigated the path with precision and care. From a distance, Sarah looked like any other person enjoying a stroll in the park. To an unknowing observer, there was nothing unusual about her or Max. She wore casual clothes, a comfortable sweater and jeans, and moved with a quiet confidence. But for those who looked a little closer, they might notice something different. Sarah didn't hold the harness casually as someone walking their pet might. Instead, her grip was purposeful, and her movements followed Max's lead. Sarah was blind. She had been since she was a child. For her, the world was a landscape of sounds, textures, and smells. She relied on Max not just as her guide but as her constant companion, her protector, and her best friend. Together, they formed a bond stronger than words could describe. Max was no ordinary dog. His calm demeanor and sharp focus hinted at years of training and experience. He wasn't just a guide dog, he was a hero in disguise. Hidden beneath his friendly appearance was a legacy of bravery that no one in the park knew about. Max had been trained not only to guide Sarah safely but also to face challenges most dogs and even people could never handle. He had once been part of search and rescue missions, saving lives in dangerous situations. He had medals, certificates, and stories of heroism that Sarah rarely spoke of. For her, Max was simply Max, her loyal companion who made her life brighter and safer. As Sarah and Max walked along the trail, the sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. The sounds of the park were comforting to Sarah. She could hear the rustling of leaves as a light breeze passed through, the faint hum of bicycles zipping by, and the occasional splash from the nearby pond where ducks played. Max guided her around obstacles, a stray soccer ball, a cluster of children sitting on the edge of the path, always alert, always watchful. "Good boy, Max," Sarah said softly, her voice warm with affection. She reached down briefly to pat his head. Max's tail wagged in response, a silent acknowledgement of her trust in him. Despite the lively scene, most people in the park paid little attention to Sarah and Max. They were just another pair among the many visitors enjoying the day. A few noticed the harness and realized Max was a guide dog. Some nodded in admiration, while others smiled politely before going on their way. Sarah didn't mind the lack of attention. She preferred it this way, quiet, unassuming, and peaceful. But Max was always aware. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, his ears twitching at every sound. While Sarah walked with calm confidence, Max was on duty. He noticed the jogger approaching quickly from behind and adjusted their pace slightly to avoid a collision. He spotted a squirrel darting across the trail and resisted the urge to chase it, his focus unwavering. Max wasn't just walking, he was protecting Sarah with every step. Today felt like any other day. There was nothing unusual about the park, the weather, or the people. Yet, beneath the surface, Max's instincts told him to stay extra alert. He couldn't explain it, it was just a feeling, a subtle tension in the air that only he seemed to sense. Sarah, unaware of Max's unease, enjoyed the walk, listening to the sounds of laughter and life around her. From a distance, they looked like a picture of serenity. A young woman and her faithful dog, walking together in harmony. But Max's past experiences had taught him one thing: peace could be interrupted in an instant. And though Sarah couldn't see it, Max had spotted something that made his ears perk up and his body tense ever so slightly. It was a group of bikers, their loud engines roaring as they entered the parking lot near the trail. The noise startled a few children, making them cling to their parents. Some joggers paused, looking back at the newcomers with curiosity or mild irritation. The bikers, dressed in leather jackets and sunglasses, didn't seem to care about the disruption they were causing. They laughed loudly, their voices carrying across the park. Sarah didn't hear the bikers at first. The sounds of the engines were faint from where she was. But Max heard them. His ears flattened briefly before standing tall again, his body stiffening. He didn't bark or pull at the harness, but his posture shifted. He was ready. From a distance, Sarah and Max still seemed like any other park visitors. No one watching them could have guessed that the peaceful afternoon was about to change, or that Max's hidden heroism was about to come to light. The trouble began with a sound that shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the park. It was loud, harsh, and unmistakable, the roar of motorcycle engines tearing through the quiet. People turned their heads toward the commotion, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Children paused their play, some clutching their parents' hands as they looked toward the parking lot. The birds that had been chirping happily moments ago fell silent, startled by the sudden noise. Sarah didn't react at first. The loud engines were noticeable, of course, but she trusted Max completely. He had guided her through all kinds of situations, from busy city streets to crowded public events. She knew he wouldn't let anything happen to her. Her grip on the harness remained steady as Max continued leading her along the trail. But the engines grew louder. The bikers were closer now, their voices carrying across the park. They weren't just passing through, they were making their presence known. The laughter and shouts that followed weren't the joyful sounds of people enjoying the day. They were taunting, mocking. A chill crept through the warm afternoon air, and Sarah couldn't ignore it any longer. "Hey, lady," one of the bikers called out. His voice was sharp, tinged with mockery. "Lost your way? Need a hand?" Laughter erupted from the group, each voice adding to the cruel chorus. The sound was harsh, almost piercing, and Sarah felt her heart tighten. She didn't need to see them to understand their tone. These weren't people offering help, they were looking for trouble. Max stopped. His body tensed, his sharp eyes locking onto the group of bikers. His tail, which had been wagging gently moments ago, was now still. His ears perked up, listening intently to every sound. He could sense the threat, and his instincts kicked in immediately. Sarah gently tugged at the harness, urging Max to move forward. "It's okay, Max," she whispered, though her voice wavered slightly. "Let's just keep walking." Max obeyed, but he didn't relax. His steps were deliberate, his head turning slightly to keep the bikers in view as they approached. The group wasn't letting up. Their laughter grew louder, their voices more aggressive. "Look at that dog," one of them shouted. "What's he gonna do, huh? Protect her." Another biker revved his engine, the noise cutting through the air like a knife. Sarah flinched at the sudden sound, her fingers tightening on Max's harness. She tried to keep her head high, her pace steady, but her heart was racing. Max's sharp bark broke through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, an unmistakable warning. The bikers laughed even harder. "Whoa, the mutt thinks he's tough," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What a joke." The jeers continued, and one of the bikers took it further. He swerved his bike dangerously close to Sarah and Max, the wheels kicking up a spray of loose gravel. Sarah stumbled slightly, but Max planted himself firmly in front of her, his body a barrier between her and the threat. The biker leaned back, laughing as he circled around to join his group. "Did you see that? The dog barked at me. What's he gonna do, bite my tires?" More laughter followed, and Sarah's breath quickened. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Ignore them," she whispered under her breath. "Just ignore them." But the bikers weren't letting go. They seemed to feed off each other's mockery, their taunts growing louder and crueler. Max's stance didn't waver. His eyes stayed locked on the group, his muscles coiled as if ready to spring into action at any moment. He didn't bark again, but his low growl was barely audible, a sound only Sarah could hear. It was his way of saying, "I'm here. I'll protect you." Sarah's mind raced. She wanted to turn around, to shout at the bikers to leave her alone. But she knew it wouldn't help. People like this didn't stop because you asked them to. They stopped when they were forced to, and Sarah wasn't sure how to do that without escalating the situation further. A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance. Other park visitors, drawn by the noise, watched cautiously from the sidelines. Some whispered to each other, their concern evident. But no one stepped forward to help. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but their silence only made her feel more alone. The bikers weren't done. One of them, emboldened by the attention they were getting, stepped off his bike and walked closer to Sarah. His boots crunched on the gravel path as he approached, a smirk plastered across his face. "Where you going, lady?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You can't just walk away from us. We're being friendly." Max moved immediately, positioning himself squarely between Sarah and the man. His growl deepened, his sharp teeth just visible as he bared them slightly. The man hesitated for a moment, his smirk faltering, but he quickly recovered. "Look at this mutt," he said, gesturing to Max as if showing him off to the rest of the group. "Thinks he's a guard dog or something." The others roared with laughter, their engines revving in approval. The sound was deafening, and Sarah's head throbbed from the noise and tension. She wanted to scream, to tell them to leave her alone, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached down, her hand finding Max's head. She didn't need to say anything. Max understood. The man inched closer, his hands on his hips as he stared down at Max. "What's he gonna do, huh? You think this little dog is gonna stop me?" Max didn't flinch. He didn't bark or lunge. He simply stood his ground, his gaze locked on the man. It was a standoff, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. The man's smirk faltered again, and this time, it didn't return. "Hey, come on," one of the bikers called out. "Let's go. This is boring." The man hesitated, glancing back at his group, then at Sarah and Max. Finally, with a shrug, he stepped away. "You're lucky your mutt's got guts, lady," he said, his tone half taunting, half defeated. He climbed back onto his bike, revving the engine loudly one last time. As the group roared away, the noise faded into the distance, leaving behind a shaken silence. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, some offering Sarah small nods of reassurance before walking away. Sarah let out a shaky breath, kneeling down to wrap her arms around Max. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're such a good boy." Max licked her face gently, his tail wagging once. The danger had passed, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the path ahead. For Sarah, the moment was a reminder of how much she depended on Max, not just as her guide, but as her protector and her anchor in a world she couldn't see. Sarah tightened her grip on Max's harness, her knuckles turning white as they moved forward. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she focused on the rhythmic sound of Max's paws against the gravel. Each step was steady, deliberate. He was her guide, her rock in a world of uncertainty. She trusted him completely, and that trust was what kept her moving. Behind them, the bikers were relentless. Their engines roared like angry beasts, echoing through the park. Their laughter rang out, loud and cruel, cutting through the serene sounds of the afternoon. Sarah tried to block it out, to focus on the calm presence of Max beside her. But it wasn't easy. "Hey, blind girl," one of them shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You gonna tell us where you're going? Oh, wait, you don't even know, do you?" The group erupted into laughter, their voices harsh and mean. Sarah kept walking, her head held high. She had dealt with people like this before. She had learned to endure their ignorance, their cruelty. But this felt different. It wasn't just words now, it was something more threatening, something dangerous. The bikers weren't content with just mocking her from a distance. One of them revved his engine and rode closer, swerving just behind her. The sudden roar of the bike made her flinch, and she felt Max press closer to her side. She could sense his tension, the way his muscles tightened under her hand. He was alert, ready to act if needed. "Careful there, Mutt," another biker jeered as he tossed an empty soda can toward them. It clattered on the path just inches from Max's paws. Max stopped for a moment, his ears twitching as he processed the sound. He didn't bark or lunge, he simply stood still, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the group behind them. Sarah whispered to him, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "It's okay, Max. Just keep going." Max obeyed, leading her forward again, but there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. Normally, Max exuded calmness. He was a steady, gentle guide who moved with quiet confidence. But now, his head was held high, his ears alert. His tail, which usually wagged gently as they walked, was still. He was focused, every part of him ready to protect Sarah if needed. The bikers didn't notice the shift in Max's behavior. They were too busy laughing, their taunts growing louder and crueler with each passing moment. One of them shouted, "Hey, lady. You sure you don't need help? Looks like your mutt's more lost than you are." Sarah clenched her jaw, refusing to respond. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her anger or fear. Instead, she straightened her posture, walking with quiet determination. This wasn't the first time she'd faced people like this. It probably wouldn't be the last. But she had learned to stand tall, to rely on her inner strength and on Max. As they approached the exit of the park, Sarah felt Max slow down. His steps became cautious, deliberate. Then he stopped completely, planting himself firmly in front of her. She could feel the tension in his body through the harness. His low growl rumbled, a warning that was impossible to ignore. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Max," she asked softly, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. One of the bikers noticed Max's change in stance and laughed. "Look at him. The little mutt thinks he's tough." He revved his engine, the noise loud and jarring. Then, with a smirk, he stepped off his bike and walked toward them. "Let's see what your dog can do," he sneered, his tone full of mockery. "Come on, mutt. Show me what you've got." The other bikers cheered him on, their voices blending into a cacophony of jeers and taunts. But Max didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on the approaching man. His growl deepened, a sound that sent a shiver through the air. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't let her fear show. Instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her back. Her voice rang out, clear and steady, cutting through the noise. "Max, show them who you are." The words were simple, but they carried weight. It wasn't just a command, it was a declaration, a statement of trust. Max understood. He always understood. In a flash, Max moved. He didn't attack, but his actions were precise, deliberate. He stepped forward, his body tense and ready. His growl turned into a sharp bark, loud and commanding. It wasn't the sound of a frightened dog, it was the sound of authority, of power. The man stopped in his tracks, his smirk faltering as he looked at Max. For the first time, hesitation flickered in his eyes. The other bikers fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats. They hadn't expected this. They had underestimated Max, just as they had underestimated Sarah. Max didn't move again. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the man step back, his bravado fading. "Come on, man," one of the bikers called out, his voice uncertain. "Leave it. It's not worth it." The man hesitated for a moment longer, then shrugged as if the whole thing had been a joke. "Yeah, whatever," he muttered, turning back toward his bike. "Not worth my time." As the bikers rode away, their engines fading into the distance, Sarah let out a shaky breath. She knelt down beside Max, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to him. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and pride. "You're such a good boy." Max's tail wagged gently, the tension leaving his body. He leaned into Sarah's touch, his soft eyes meeting hers as if to say, "I've got you. Always." For Sarah, the moment was a reminder of why she trusted Max so deeply. He wasn't just her guide, he was her protector, her partner, her hero. What happened next left the park frozen in stunned silence. The laughter and jeers of the bikers stopped abruptly as Max sprang into action. It wasn't a wild leap or an uncontrolled attack. No, it was something far more deliberate. In a blur of golden fur, Max lunged forward, his movements quick and precise. His teeth clamped onto the biker's sleeve not to harm, but to hold. And hold he did, with a grip so firm that the biker couldn't pull away. The man froze for a moment, stunned by Max's unexpected move. Then he yanked his arm, trying to free himself. But Max didn't let go. His strong jaws held the fabric like a steel vise, his eyes locked on the man with a look that spoke volumes. Max wasn't just a guide dog anymore. He was a protector, a guardian who wouldn't let harm come to Sarah. "Get off me, you stupid dog," the biker yelled, his voice rising in panic. He pulled harder, his feet stumbling on the gravel, but it was no use. Max was immovable, his strength undeniable. The other bikers stood nearby, their confidence visibly shaken. The smirks and laughter were gone, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. They had thought it was all a joke, a harmless bit of bullying. But now they were realizing they had picked the wrong target. "Max, enough." Sarah's voice rang out, calm but commanding. At her word, Max immediately released the man's sleeve. He stepped back, sitting down beside Sarah with a calm authority that demanded respect. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes stayed locked on the biker, as if to say, "Try that again, and you'll regret it." The man stumbled back, staring at his sleeve where Max's teeth had left small marks. His bravado was gone, replaced by an expression of humiliation and fear. "What's wrong with that dog?" he muttered, rubbing his arm as if it hurt. "That's no ordinary dog," someone murmured from the growing crowd. People had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Parents with children, joggers, dog walkers, they all stood in a loose circle, their attention fixed on Sarah and Max. Phones were out, cameras pointed at the scene. The bikers, who had been so loud and bold just moments ago, were now under the watchful eyes of dozens of onlookers. Sarah turned her face toward the bikers, her expression calm but resolute. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the crowd, the silence that hung in the air. She reached down to gently pat Max's head, her fingers brushing through his soft fur. "Max isn't just a guide dog," she said, her voice steady. "He's a search and rescue champion. Medal winning. Trained to save lives." She paused, letting the words sink in before adding, "And he won't let anyone hurt me." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Their tough exteriors were crumbling under the weight of Sarah's words and the intensity of Max's presence. One of them, the man Max had grabbed, opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. He looked at his friends for support, but they seemed just as unsure. A young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her phone raised. "You guys think you're tough, picking on someone like her," she called out. "Well, guess what? Everyone here just saw what happened. It's all on camera." The man with the torn sleeve stammered, We didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke, okay." "A joke," another voice from the crowd replied, sharp with anger. "Harassing a blind woman and her dog is a joke to you." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. The bikers shuffled nervously, their bravado evaporating with each passing second. They had come into the park to make noise, to assert dominance, but now they were cornered, their actions exposed for all to see. The biker who had spoken earlier tried again, his tone weaker this time. "Look, we're sorry, okay? We didn't know." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her calm expression never wavering. "You didn't know what?" she asked. "That I couldn't see you? That I wouldn't stand up for myself? Or that my dog is smarter and braver than all of you put together?" Max wagged his tail once, as if to punctuate Sarah's words. A small ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. The bikers looked around, realizing there was no escape from the judgment of the people surrounding them. One of them nudged the leader, muttering something under his breath. The leader sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "We're sorry. It won't happen again." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She let the silence linger, her hand resting on Max's head. Then she nodded once. "Good," she said simply. The bikers hurried back to their bikes, their movements rushed and clumsy. They revved their engines, the loud noise no longer sounding threatening but desperate. One by one, they rode out of the park, leaving behind only the faint smell of exhaust and the awkward memory of their failed intimidation. As the sound of the bikes faded, the crowd erupted into applause. People clapped, cheered, and even whistled. Some shouted words of encouragement. "Way to go, Max. You're amazing, Sarah. What a hero." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with warmth. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she couldn't help smiling. She knelt down beside Max, wrapping her arms around him. "You're incredible," she whispered. "Thank you." Max licked her face gently, his tail wagging again. For him, it wasn't about the applause or the attention. He had done what he was trained to do: protect Sarah. And he had done it perfectly. As the crowd began to disperse, several people came up to Sarah to offer their support. Some shook her hand, others simply smiled and nodded. A little boy with a small dog on a leash approached hesitantly. "Your dog is so cool," he said, his eyes wide with admiration. "I wish my dog could do that." Sarah laughed softly. "Max is one of a kind," she said. "But your dog looks pretty great too." The boy beamed, and his mother thanked Sarah before leading him away. As the park slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Sarah and Max resumed their walk. The tension from earlier had faded, replaced by a sense of peace and pride. Sarah held Max's harness with a steady hand, her steps confident. She knew that the world wasn't always kind, that people like the bikers would always exist. But she also knew she wasn't alone. With Max by her side, she could face anything. Max wasn't just her guide, he was her protector, her partner, and her hero. And today, he had shown the world exactly who he was. The bikers scrambled for their bikes, tripping over their own feet in their haste to get away. The once loud laughter and jeers that had filled the park were gone, replaced by hurried muttering and excuses. "We were just joking," one of them shouted, his voice shaky and defensive as he climbed onto his motorcycle. Another added, "Yeah, we didn't mean any harm." But the crowd wasn't buying it. People stood with arms crossed or shaking their heads in disapproval. The bikers' bravado had vanished completely, leaving only the sound of their engines sputtering to life as they prepared to flee. One of them fumbled with his helmet, dropping it before awkwardly picking it up again. It was clear they couldn't leave fast enough. The loud roar of their engines filled the air as they sped off, a trail of dust and exhaust marking their hasty retreat. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely. For a moment, the park was silent, as if the world had paused to take a breath. Then, the silence was broken by a wave of applause and cheers. The onlookers, who had watched the entire scene unfold, erupted in celebration. Some clapped their hands, others whistled, and a few even called out words of encouragement. "Way to go, Max," someone shouted. "That dog's amazing," another added. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and pride wash over her. She knelt down beside Max, her fingers running through his soft fur. "You did it again, Max," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You always do." Max wagged his tail gently, his golden eyes fixed on her. He seemed calm, but there was a spark of satisfaction in his gaze. For Max, protecting Sarah wasn't a job, it was his purpose. And once again, he had proven that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. As Sarah stroked Max's fur, several people from the crowd approached her. A middle-aged woman with a kind smile stepped forward first. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Sarah nodded, her smile warm but humble. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." She gestured toward Max. "Thanks to him." The woman bent down to pat Max gently on the head. "What a good boy," she said. "You're so lucky to have him." "I am," Sarah agreed. "He's more than a dog, he's my hero." A man holding a phone approached next. "I got the whole thing on video," he said, his tone a mix of awe and indignation. "I can send it to the police if you want. Those bikers need to learn a lesson." Before Sarah could respond, a voice behind her said, "That won't be necessary. We'll take it from here." She turned to see a uniformed police officer walking toward her. He was tall, with a kind face and a professional demeanor. He tipped his hat slightly as he stopped in front of her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "we've dealt with troublemakers like that before. But I have to say," he looked down at Max and nodded, "I've never seen anything like him. He's a real hero." Sarah smiled, her hand still resting on Max's head. "He is," she said softly. "He always has been." The officer crouched down to Max's level, meeting the dog's calm, intelligent gaze. "You're one impressive pup," he said. "You've got more courage than most people I know." Max responded with a small wag of his tail, his posture relaxed but alert. The officer stood up and turned back to Sarah. "If those guys come back or cause any more trouble, don't hesitate to call us," he said. "But honestly, I don't think they'll be back anytime soon. Your dog scared them off better than any squad car could." Sarah chuckled lightly. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate it." As the officer stepped away, more people from the crowd came up to Sarah, offering words of support and admiration. A young boy with a small dog on a leash approached hesitantly. His dog, a scrappy little terrier, barked excitedly as they drew closer. "Your dog is so cool," the boy said, his eyes wide with awe. "I wish my dog could do that." Sarah smiled warmly. "Max is special," she said. "But I'm sure your dog is amazing too." The boy grinned, looking down at his terrier. "Maybe he'll be brave like Max someday." "I'm sure he will," Sarah replied. As the boy and his mother walked away, Sarah took a deep breath, the tension of the encounter finally starting to fade. She felt a wave of gratitude not just for Max but for the people who had stepped up, who had shown her that she wasn't alone. Max nudged her hand gently, pulling her from her thoughts. "You're right, Max," she said, standing up and brushing off her jeans. Time to move on. Together, they began to walk down the path again. The park felt different now, not quieter, but warmer, friendlier. People waved at her as she passed, some offering a kind word or a smile. It was as if Max's courage had reminded everyone of the importance of standing up for what's right. Sarah couldn't see the admiring glances or the way people whispered about her bravery and Max's heroism. But she could feel it in the air, a sense of respect and solidarity that wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. As they reached the edge of the park, Sarah paused for a moment. She knelt down beside Max once more, her hand resting on his harness. "You're not just my guide, Max," she said softly. "You're my protector. My partner. My hero." Max wagged his tail, his golden eyes full of understanding. He leaned into her touch, his presence steady and reassuring. For Sarah, that was all she needed. With Max by her side, she could face anything. And as they walked away, the park slowly returning to its usual rhythm behind them, Sarah knew one thing for certain: Max wasn't just her guide dog. He was her guardian, her friend, and her greatest source of strength. Together, they could take on the world and win. As Sarah and Max continued their walk, the air around them felt calmer, almost as if the park itself had taken a deep breath and settled into a peaceful rhythm. The chatter of children playing, the soft rustling of leaves, and the occasional bark of a dog once again filled the space. But something was different. To Sarah, it felt like the park was a little quieter, a little safer than before. She couldn't see the way people turned to look at her and Max as they passed, their faces lit with admiration. She couldn't hear the whispered praises from those who had witnessed what had just happened. "That dog is amazing," someone said. "She's so brave," murmured another. But Sarah could feel it. The energy around her had shifted, and it was warm, comforting, like the quiet applause of a world that had just seen something remarkable. Sarah's fingers rested lightly on Max's harness as he guided her forward, his steps steady and confident. She let out a soft sigh, her heart still racing slightly from the encounter with the bikers. But as her breathing steadied, a deep sense of gratitude began to wash over her. She reached down and patted Max's head gently. "You're my hero, Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the park. Max's ears twitched, and he looked up at her briefly, his golden eyes filled with loyalty and love. His tail wagged just once, a small but unmistakable sign of his happiness. For Max, this was just another day of doing what he was meant to do, protecting Sarah, guiding her, being by her side through everything. As they walked, Sarah's mind wandered back to the bikers and how quickly everything had unfolded. She thought about the fear she had felt, the cruel words, the sound of the engines roaring, and how helpless she had felt at first. But then there was Max. He had been calm, strong, and fearless when she needed him the most. His actions had turned the tide, not just for her, but for everyone who had been watching. Max wasn't just a guide dog, she realized. He was a symbol of courage, of standing tall even when the odds seemed overwhelming. He didn't back down, and because of him, neither had she. Sarah smiled faintly as she thought about the crowd that had cheered for Max, the people who had come up to her afterward to offer their support. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel their kindness. It was a reminder that there were good people in the world, people who stood up for what was right, who believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. She thought about how easy it would have been to give in to fear, to let the bikers' words and actions break her spirit. But Max hadn't let that happen. He had reminded her that strength didn't always come from being the loudest or the biggest. Sometimes, the greatest strength was quiet, steady, and unwavering. It was the kind of strength that came from belief in yourself, in the people around you, and, in Sarah's case, belief in Max. Max had always been her eyes, guiding her through the world with patience and precision. But today, he had shown her and everyone else something even more profound. He wasn't just her guide. He was her protector, her partner, her hero. As they continued down the path, Sarah felt a renewed sense of confidence. The park, which had seemed overwhelming and chaotic just moments ago, now felt like a place where she belonged. She tilted her head slightly, listening to the sounds around her. She could hear the rhythmic footsteps of joggers, the distant laughter of children, and the gentle chirping of birds. Each sound felt sharper, clearer, as if the world had opened itself up to her in a new way. She thought about the young boy who had approached her earlier, his eyes wide with admiration for Max. "Your dog is so cool," he had said, and Sarah had smiled, sensing the wonder in his voice. She hoped that boy would remember this day not because of the bikers, but because of Max. She hoped he would grow up knowing that bravery wasn't about being fearless, it was about standing up for what mattered, even when you were scared. Sarah's thoughts turned inward. Life hadn't always been easy for her. Losing her sight at a young age had been a challenge she wouldn't wish on anyone. There had been moments of frustration, of sadness, of feeling like the world was closing in on her. But there had also been moments of triumph, of connection, of realizing that she was stronger than she ever thought possible. Max had been a big part of that. From the moment they had been paired together, he had changed her life. He had given her independence, freedom, and a sense of security that she hadn't felt in a long time. But more than that, he had given her a partner, a friend who understood her in a way no one else could. As they neared the edge of the park, Sarah stopped for a moment, turning her face toward the sunlight. She felt its warmth on her skin, a gentle reminder of the beauty in the world. She knelt down beside Max, her hand resting on his harness. "Max," she said softly, her voice full of emotion, "you're not just my guide. You're my everything. I don't know what I'd do without you." Max leaned into her touch, his body relaxed and calm. His tail wagged again, a silent acknowledgement of her words. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the greatest strength isn't in what you see, it's in what you believe. She couldn't see the park, the people, or even Max's face. But she could feel his presence, his loyalty, his love. And that was more powerful than anything she could have imagined. As Sarah stood and took hold of Max's harness again, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Together, they began to walk away from the park, their steps steady and sure. The world was still full of challenges, of people who might not understand her, of moments that might test her strength. But she knew she could face them all. With Max by her side, she was never alone. And as they disappeared down the path, the sun shining brightly overhead, Sarah carried with her a simple but profound truth: true strength comes from within, and sometimes, it takes a loyal friend to remind you of just how strong you are.